If you have a true scary story you want to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. I often go camping and hiking on my own as a way to decompress from everyday life and enjoy the gift that is nature. After sleeping under the stars, I always felt rejuvenated and ready to take on the world again. But after this specific trip, I did not come back with that same energized feeling, and I will never forget it. I was taking a trip through a remote forest in northern Michigan. It's not the first time I've been in this particular set of woods, so I had an idea of where I was at, and where I wanted to stay. I set off with my always well-prepared pack, and scouted out where I wanted to stay for the night. The first few days and nights even went exactly as I wanted. I hiked the trail, spent time in the small creek, watched frogs and other creatures in the water and birds in the trees. It was absolutely rejuvenating. Then on the third night, things took a turn. The sky was starting to darken unexpectedly, so I was anticipating rain. I reluctantly set up my tent to sleep in for the night, not wanting to be potentially soaked by morning. I settled into my tent for the night and listened to the sounds of wildlife to lull me to sleep. I was starting to doze off, right in the in-between states of awake and asleep, when I noticed something. Or rather, the lack of something. The sound I was listening to was now gone. The crickets chirping was gone. The owls were silent. Even the slight swaying sound of the tree branches from the wind seemed to have lost their voice. I held my breath to see if maybe I was mistaken, but I quickly picked up on a prickling sensation creeping up my spine. Something now felt off. Again, this wasn't my first time camping in these woods, so I assumed it was wildlife. Something was nearby and probably spotted my tent, or even picked up on my scent and became curious. I can usually just let it pass and be fine, but this feeling was giving me predator vibes. I decided to look out of my tent to see if I could figure out what it was, and if I needed to try and scare it away or run away myself. I unzipped part of my tent and scanned the tree line. It didn't take long for me to spot a dark shadow that, if I'm being honest, seemed to shift and writhe in ways that defied logic. But then I noticed what I believed to be eyes. They were huge and had almost a red hue to them, but the height of those eyes was even more alarming. Even from the distance, the eyes reached the lower branches of the trees. That's when I started hearing a low rumbling sound, almost like a growling. But I could feel it in my feet where I stood. For once, since I've started going on these trips, I was frozen, not knowing what to do. I didn't have a car, so I had no chance of running or driving away. I just slowly zipped back up my tent, laid down and listened, praying for whatever it was to lose interest in me and walk off. Of course, I couldn't get that lucky. Shortly after, I could hear the crunching of leaves and sticks as if someone or something was walking on them. The sound was getting closer and closer to my tent, and I tried my best to control my breathing and remain calm. As I continued to listen, I could hear the creature's massive breathing. It sounded similar to a dog sniffing around, but put through an amplifier. As it got louder and closer to my tent, I could sense its presence. With the moonlight against my tent, I could make out the silhouette of a creature that was now too close for comfort. It was just as enormous as I thought. It had to be 8, maybe 9 feet tall. The shape was bizarrely unnatural. It had a mix of human and animal features. It was walking on all fours, but then stood on 2 as it pressed its face against my tent. That's how I could tell not only its height, but the fact that it had a snout. The spine also seemed to have a sharp curve to it, like it had a hunched back or how a cat looks when it's frightened. but the stench was honestly what nearly got me in trouble. It was a stomach-churning mix of rotting meat, wet dog, and something chemical. I couldn't really tell what, though. I tried to remain calm, but the smell was making me sick. I was holding back from gagging, hoping the creature would pass soon and not realize there was someone in the tent, but I couldn't hold back anymore. The stench was unbearable, and I actually dry-heaved. That's when the creature let out another growl, but it seemed to carry a hint of almost a human-like vocalization. It was like it was trying to speak but couldn't form the words. The sound was just uncanny, and made the whole situation that much more terrifying. That this weird beast or creature was maybe trying to talk to me, but after it tried to speak, I could hear it walking back the direction from which it came. I continued to lay there, too afraid to move, but once the stench was completely gone and I couldn't hear the growling or walking, I mustered up the courage to look out of my tent again. It was definitely gone, but it was also still silent. I went back into my camp, took out my little hatchet from my bag, and laid still, waiting to fall asleep. I figured it was safer for me to try to stay put for the night, and then leave the next morning, rather than to try to take down my tent and walk through the dark trees. By morning, I awoke to birds chirping and even a few nearby frogs, so whatever came by that night must be long gone. I got out of my tent, hatchet still in hand, and walked around the area as I wanted to look for tracks, and it certainly didn't take long. It seemed like it rained a little bit, but not much. My tent wasn't even wet anymore, but on the ground near my tent, I could see the prints. They looked like massive canine-like prints, easily twice the size of a wolf's. I followed them to where they stopped at my tent and faced forward towards it, and then followed the prints back away from my tent and into the trees, where the prints were lost in the leaves and grass. But back in those trees, I saw something that added to my fear. There was a spot in the ground where the grass and leaves were flattened. Something was obviously lying there. Was that creature watching me? And was it watching after it left, or before? The thought of being watched like prey made me even more uncomfortable. Something was not right about this. This was no longer a fun, get-lost-in-nature sort of trip, so I packed up and left. Since then, I researched known animals in the area, trying to convince myself that it was just an abnormally large wolf, but I can't get past the part where it stood on its back legs. This wasn't a quick up like some house dogs do. It stood as if it was a natural position for it. Not to mention that it walked like that. But as silly as this is going to sound, the only thing that keeps coming back around is that I may have witnessed the Dogman. I didn't pay much attention to cryptids and things of the sort prior, but I mean, it could just be some kind of deformed creature. Or maybe something we haven't quite identified yet. It's entirely possible. I've told a few friends about my sightings before, and they were intrigued. We've gone camping in the same area since, hoping to spot it, but so far, it has yet to come back. Or at least it hasn't made itself known. Who knows, maybe it just watched us in the distance without us having the slightest idea. Maybe it's waiting for us to trail off alone before it'll come out of hiding. I have a strange story that may be uneventful to some, but was seriously weird and bizarre at the time. This was in the 80s, so I have no evidence or proof of it happening, no photos or news articles or anything. It's just a story that I can tell, and all I can do is say that it's true and that it happened. When I was young, I used to love going camping in the summer with my dad, uncle, and cousins. I was the only boy that my parents had, but my uncle had 3 boys that were all kind of close to my age, so we all went as a group. So, 6 people total. I won't get into their names because it's not important, I'll just refer to them as my cousins. We had always gone camping at the same place. I don't remember exactly where it was, it's been a long time, but it was a campground that was on this massive lake, and it always took us an hour or so to get there when we would go. We would spend about a week out in the woods going fishing, swimming, and just doing whatever we wanted within reason. This was my 3rd year going with them, so I would have been around 10 at the time. We got there, got set up, and the first night, and even the next day, were uneventful. The 3rd day is when things got weird, or at least, I guess, started to. We had all woken up with the same thought. It was time to go swimming in the lake. My dad hated going into the water, but my uncle didn't mind, so my dad was going to be fishing a bit down the shore, and the 5 of us would be in the water. We all got our stuff together and started to head down to the part of the shore where it was most shallow and easiest to swim in. But when we got there, we all kind of paused. There near the shore were several dead and completely destroyed fish corpses. It looked like something had taken a full bite out of them and the remainder had floated off to the shore. But it wasn't just 1 or 2. It was a solid dozen or so. It was kind of gross, and it really did hurt the vibe for me, so I decided I would just go over and go fishing with my dad, because I didn't want to be near dead fish parts. So I was sitting over by my dad, my cousins were swimming, and my uncle was watching from a chair on the shore, when my youngest cousin made a comment about one of the other 2 touching his leg. They said that they hadn't, that they weren't even close enough to do so, and the younger one kept complaining that something was rubbing against his leg. My older cousin stepped over to him to see what was going on, when he grabbed my younger cousin and told the other one to get out of the water right there, and then ran to the shore. My uncle stood up and asked what was happening. I was watching them, and my dad was just as confused. We walked over to them to see what was up, when my older cousin started explaining what he saw. He claimed that when he stepped over to my little cousin, he saw what was brushing against him, and it wasn't like anything he'd ever seen prior. The way he described it was like an eel. It wasn't like a fish. It was long, had a very pronounced mouth, and was kind of slithering like a snake, so again, like an eel. The thing was that he said this eel was at least 8 feet long. Obviously, I don't know if he was mistaken or exaggerating, but I have to imagine that even if he was mistaken, as a scared child, he couldn't be too far off the mark. My uncle told him to stop messing around, that there weren't any eels in the water, and especially not ones that large. But it was actually my dad that cut him off. He grabbed what I now know to be his polarized sunglasses from his fishing vest pocket and put them on, and was watching the water's surface intently. I remember the tremble in his voice because it was the only time I had ever heard him scared at that point in my life. He said, Ron, I don't think he's lying," and handed him the glasses, and then pointed in the direction where my cousins were. My uncle's mouth fell open as he watched. They both said that they saw the eel thing that my cousin had mentioned, and that it was slithering around where they were, and then it went into the deeper water further off. Obviously, they were in awe. They had never seen anything like this, and even now, I've never known of a freshwater eel to get that large, and we had never seen eels in that water. We ended up taking our stuff back to the campsite, and my uncle went and reported that there was a very large, possibly non-native creature in the water. The forest workers said they would go and check it out, and see if they could find it, but obviously I have no idea if they ever did. We didn't go back in the water on that camping trip. We fished on the other end of the lake, but not at that shore. I know a lot of people may say, oh, it was an eel, so scary, but it wasn't that it was an eel. It's that it was this giant eel that was, for whatever reason, very active near the shore and was clearly hungry. It's also the thought that it kept swimming around and rubbing against my little cousin that is scary to me. Like, was it trying to determine if it could tear into him next? Was it measuring him up and trying to see if it was capable of tearing some of his flesh off? Also, I know we do have freshwater eels in the US, but this thing was, based on the description given, way larger than they get. I've read that they can get around 4 feet long, but the adults and my cousin have stated that this thing was minimum 8 foot, and was very thick around, not slender like normal eels. To me, this was a terrifying event because it was so strange. I've heard a lot of cryptid stories out there, but never anything about large water creatures like this. Though maybe this was just a natural thing and not a cryptid per se, but it was cryptid parallel. A strange and possibly unidentified creature. Either way, it was scary, and the next time we went camping, we actually went to a different campground, and stuck with that one until we were all just sort of done with the camping trips. This first encounter took place in the summer of, I believe, 2016, in Ontario, Canada. Although it was a while ago, I still remember every detail like it was yesterday. If I'd been alone, I would have chalked it up to something else, but the fact that both of us saw this thing is what really puts me off. A friend and I were walking on a trail that runs alongside the main river that cuts through the city. There are some great wooded trails along the river, and some of them even lead to neighboring cities, but I digress. The sun was setting, and it was that time of evening where it was insanely dark under the tree coverage, but still fairly light beyond the leaves. I had turned on my phone flashlight to light the way, and put on some music for the two of us to listen to while we hustled home. The bugs were starting to bite, and being so close to the river, they get pretty nasty. I had paused to change the song on my phone, and my friend glances to her left into the woods. She asks me, "What's that?" And instinctively I turned the light to where she was looking. In the darkness of the bushes and trees, we watch as this thing takes off running deeper into the brush, with its back turned to us. It was making a ton of noise. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. It really didn't seem to care. Now, there are deer on this trail. I've seen a few on my walks during the day, but this was absolutely no deer. Even in such a short amount of time, the image of this thing running from us is burned in my mind. It was on all fours. It had an awkward gait like a human trying to run on its hands and feet, meaning its arms were far too short compared to its legs to be running like that. This thing was white, and the light reflected off its leathery-looking skin. It was skinny with thin arms and legs. The two of us didn't stick around much longer after that, and instead chose to run the rest of the trail until we hit the end that leads out into a set of soccer fields. We never spoke about it after that, and if we did, it was sort of in passing. That was until yesterday. I was scrolling the subreddit for my city, and paused the minute I saw a title informing people to stay away from the river trails. Curious, I checked the post out. The post described exactly what my friend and I had seen that night on those exact sets of trails by the river. I broke out into a cold sweat and immediately texted her despite not speaking for a while, as adulthood has kind of caught up to us both. She told me that she still thinks about that encounter and does so at least once a week. I linked her the post and she was floored by it. I unfortunately won't be able to link to the post as it gives identifying information, but reading through the replies, it was what you would expect from Reddit. People chalking it up to the guy being mentally ill, joking about him doing drugs, and people who genuinely took him seriously were being downvoted and mocked. Someone mentioned it was all bull and that stories of these things had been going around the area since 1972, meaning this probably wasn't a one-off experience from the beginning. I'm always a little hesitant to share the story out of fear that I would get the same reception. I know what I saw that night, and knowing it's possibly still in those woods, along a set of trails I still walk to this day, is kind of unsettling for me. Growing up near the Great Lakes, I spent countless summers swimming, boating, and just exploring the shorelines. Ever since I learned to swim, it was hard to keep me out of the water. Swimming, boating, or just walking along the coast could change my mood in a heartbeat. Like it just wipes away all of my stress and concern. Lake Superior was always my favorite. I loved being out there on a calm, clear day, seeing the deep blue waters reflect the fluffy white clouds above. The water is so clear that you can practically see straight to the bottom of the shallow areas, revealing all the pebbles and small fish. Then there are the surrounding Pictured Rocks National Lake shore of colored sandstone cliffs, streaked with mineral stains of different colors. Being out there is truly humbling and awe-inspiring. It's no wonder I would spend several days a month out there when I had free time, but after one trip to the lake back in early 2000s, my view of it considerably changed. It was early September and I decided to take advantage of my extra time off work due to the Labor Day weekend. It was unseasonably warm at the time, so I figured I could sneak in one last kayaking trip for the year. I was in my mid-20s at this point, and had gone on this route countless times with my parents, friends, and even alone, so it was nothing new for me. I always found something new to appreciate along the way, but I at least knew where I was going. As I paddled past the more populated spots, the sense of isolation began to settle in. I reached a more secluded cove that I had discovered on a previous trip, and I decided that that would be my stopping place to enjoy my lunch and my book. After I finished eating, I got myself settled to read a few chapters, much like I had done in the past. I was probably only a few pages in when I noticed something odd. At first, it started with a weird sensation, one that told me that I needed to look up or watch my surroundings. I looked around, and when I didn't immediately spot another person or any kind of wildlife, I told myself it was probably just from being alone out there. But then I noticed the water. The water that was just crystal clear when I had arrived was now murky and dark. I focused on it, puzzled as to what could have caused that in such a large area. I mean, I could spot where I was from the shoreline. Then, the bubbles began to rise to the surface. I've seen bubbles before from air being trapped under rocks or something else in the water, maybe even some small bubbles from fish, but these seemed to have no end to them. I watched on, trying to figure out the source of the bubbles. I was curious if maybe it was a large snapping turtle, but part of me also kept saying that this was far too large of an area to be a snapper. I know they can get big, but I have never heard of one this size before. I remember telling myself, as a joke of course, that it must have been a submarine because of the size. That's how large it was. But then something started emerging from the water, and it was far from a submarine or a turtle. At first, I saw a lump of gray purple emerging. It looked slick and rubbery like a giant salamander. I couldn't make out any discerning features, so I still didn't know what I was looking at. Then, as it came up more, all I can say was I was frozen in awe and terror. It opened its eyes, and what I'd been looking at was an eyelid. It was kind of cone-shaped, similar to a chameleon. It seemed to be looking all over the area, scanning it in a sense. I sat still and silent, my book obviously closed now, watching to see if it would emerge more. But while the eye didn't move from its position, I saw something moving in the water in front of it. It looked as though it was a snake floating across the water. I slowly stood up to get a better look at it, but again I was wrong. It was not a snake that I was looking at. It had to be connected to this thing because it was the same gray, purplish color and rubbery texture. So it had at least one eye above the water that was probably the size of a turtle, and now something slithering towards me? A tentacle, perhaps? But what on earth was living in Lake Superior with tentacles? Startled, I jumped backwards, which also seemed to startle this creature. My small self, in comparison, scared this large beast, I know. The next thing I saw was the water splashing back towards the creature's eye, and then both quickly disappeared into the water, leaving me with a deep resonant call that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was like a whale song but distorted, and honestly just sounded otherworldly. It gave me goosebumps all over my body. Once it was silent and the water was still, I composed myself to think over what I just saw. That didn't go very well, because I didn't have the slightest clue. But at that point, the realization that I was secluded and alone no longer felt serene, but dangerous. I gathered my belongings and quickly made my way back to my kayak. I watched the water where this creature had emerged from, but the water was back to being unbelievably still. I rowed away, looking back several times, worried that it might come for me again, hence I would have nowhere to go. I don't think I've ever rowed that fast in my life. I finally got back to the shore and tried to pick up as quickly as possible, and tried to control my breathing to not appear crazy around others. Unfortunately, being about 2004 when this happened, cell phones weren't what they were. The phone that I had didn't even have a camera, and I didn't bother to take it with me as it didn't get a signal out on the lakes anyways. So all I have to go off of is my memory. When I returned home that evening, I called my dad to immediately tell him what I saw. He thought it was bizarre too, and we both went into this rabbit hole of sorts to research and try to figure out what it was. To this day, we still don't have an answer. My dad even asked a few of his friends who were park rangers and a woman who worked at a wildlife conservation, and they had no idea. I've taken my dad and my friends to the same spot hoping that it might come back, but there was nothing there. So what did I witness? What could this have been? The closest thing I've come across are legends surrounding Lake Superior and those ancient underwater creatures, but nothing I've read comes close to matching what I saw or heard. However, I feel it's closer to one of these than it is some disfigured and overgrown lizard. I've continued to search for what I saw, but ever since then, seeing and experiencing this creature has humbled me, and really proven just how small I am to the world in comparison. And really, just how little we know about what lives in the deep waters below. So that, my friends, was a collection of some cryptid stories, cryptid encounter stories more so. Not just stories about cryptids, but stories about encountering said cryptids. Cryptids, for those of you who don't know, which, kind of strange, you listened to this video and didn't know what a cryptid was? That's odd. Why would you do that? Anyways, cryptids are unidentified creatures, typically of legend, things like Nessie, Bigfoot, and so forth. Those are considered cryptids, but sometimes cryptids aren't so large, well-known, however you want to say that. You get my point. Smaller cryptids, things like the thing in the lake and the thing in the lake. My point is, cryptids can be small, scary little creatures that we haven't identified that are unidentified in nature. So, yeah. Fantastic story is always creepy, always a fun time. So hopefully you all enjoyed these cryptid stories. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. That would be fantastic of you to do so. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, consider hitting that subscribe button. That would be fantastic as well. Greatly appreciated. And hit the bell icon to get notified of more videos that I post. And if you're feeling bold, you can go down below the video and leave me a comment on your thoughts, how you're doing, what's going on, so forth and so on. That'd be awesome. I would appreciate it. You can also join Patreon membership to early access to content like this if you want to do so. Never expected, always appreciated. There's also a super thanks, which is a tip to the channel, a little bit of support. Never expected again, always appreciated though. Yeah. You can also listen over on Spotify or Apple if you want to do that as well. Not all on YouTube. I'm also over there. Also on Audible, Pandora, etc., etc. And, yeah. Go to astheravendreams.com if you have a story you want to send my way. There's a big button to send me your story. All that said, friends, hope you're having a beautiful week so far, having a beautiful day. Beautiful weekend, I guess, is the proper way to say that. Beautiful day. Hope I see you again here very soon. But until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you are the best you that you can be. Do not forget it. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And until next time, my friends, much love, and sleep well.